Hey traders, welcome back to the FXE YouTube channel. Last week we killed it. Everyone was expecting sells, but I kept on calling buys. Many of the movements I was talking about are really starting to line up now. We see the yields coming down, we see DXY coming down, and we saw that explosive move on EU to the upside. This is what I was hoping, and this is how it played out. In today's video, I'll talk about the recent price action as well as go over what to expect in the future. We have more confirmation now and more clarity on what to expect. But first, hit the thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's get into it. Let's talk about the fundamentals first. Last week we had inflation, Fed rates, and non-farm payrolls data, all of which came in negative. This wasn't what I was expecting, but the result lined up well for the price action I was expecting. All of this data lines up for a short-term to mid-term dollar weakness and the bigger pullback I was expecting. This week we have very little news. The most important thing is the daylight savings ends in the US, and this is very important for everyone outside the US as they need to check and confirm all their indicators are updated with the correct time. We also have Powell speaking, so Powell will be speaking 2 times on Wednesday and Friday, and we have unemployment claims on Thursday. And that's about it. I'm not really too concerned about the rest. But one thing I am thinking about, now that we are starting to see weakness in the dollar, we may start to see intervention by the BOJ. UJ is already starting to come down thanks to the USD weakness, but BOJ may take this opportunity to intervene and push the price down further. And if they do, we may see the dollar come down even more aggressively. Now moving on to the charts, starting with the yields. You can see that we got the daily shift on the 5-year and the 10-year as I was thinking we may see. The 30-year has yet to shift, but I'm guessing it will follow. From here, we do have some inefficiencies above, so new ones that were created on the last daily candle across the board. So there is a chance that we may see a pullback, but now that we have that confirmation, we're likely to see a bigger push to the downside. And if we look at the majors as a whole, you start to get an idea of how massive the recent push to the upside was. AU and NU have been relatively weak recently, but have come up massively. And EU and GU have broken multiple levels of structure on the left. We've actually come back to September levels pretty much across the board. And now moving on to DXY, starting with the monthly time frame. So DXY is still very bullish on this time frame. You can see that DXY came back into the monthly fair value gap above and is currently reacting off of it. It's also entered the fair value gap below, so currently within 2 PD rays. And if we look lower, we have discount levels. Although we are currently in a strong area of inefficiency, for now, I do not think that the DXY weakness is done. This is based on fundamentals as well as the current order flow. And I'll assume lower pricing for now. But according to structure, we should eventually see continuation to the upside. But that could potentially be months away. Moving on to the weekly time frame, you start to get an idea of how strong the bearish pressure was last week. DXY is currently in a monthly fair value gap, and we have a tiny weekly fair value gap just below. And then we have more inefficiencies below in discount. And medium term, I'm expecting lower pricing, but short term, wouldn't be surprised if we started to see a pullback. Moving on to the daily time frame. So you can see we had a lot of choppy price action at the beginning of the week, and then we had a massive manipulation to the upside when the Fed rates were announced. Thereafter, very aggressive move to the downside, continuation the next day, and the continuation the day after. We've left behind a daily volume imbalance. We've also left behind a huge daily fair value gap. I'm a little surprised that I didn't make an attempt to go for it. And we've just been continuing down, breaking daily structure again, creating lower low, and then we came into the monthly fair value gap. We have more imbalances above and likely the creation of a fair value gap on Tuesday. Momentum is quite strong and wouldn't be surprised if we just see continuation, but we do have a lot of inefficiencies above too that DXY may go for before continuing to the downside. All in all, things are starting to line up quite well for a bigger push to the downside. The last manipulation that we had, an aggressive push to the downside thereafter, is typically what you would see before a significant move. That doesn't mean we can't retest any of it, because we can, but in terms of patterns, it's given a lot of confirmation that a bigger move is coming. And as the fundamentals are also now aligned, we could potentially see continuation for weeks, which would be more than enough time to bring the price back into discount. And you guys remember that crazy idea I presented last weekend? It doesn't look so crazy anymore. Now moving on to EU on the monthly time frame. So on this time frame, EU is bearish. We previously broke structure lows. This right here is just a pullback on this time frame, and we pulled back into the breaker block that we have here. It came into the OT level and thereafter had a reaction and aggressively pushed to the downside. That push to the downside swept all the internal liquidity. It didn't make it to the monthly fair value gap, but did have a reaction and then started to push to the upside. So this right here is a pullback within the pullback. So we've come into monthly fair value gap. We do still have premium levels above, and in this area the fair value gap would make the most sense for a reversal, but everything I've said about the fundamentals and what we're seeing on the yields and DXY right now, it would make sense if we saw EU come up higher. And assuming that we are able to break this monthly fair value gap, then we will likely see price come up probably into the order block, which would bring us to premium levels before we saw any signs of reversal and continuation to the downside. Now on the weekly time frame, you can see how massive that push up was on last week's candle. EU's come back into the weekly breaker block. There is a tiny fair value gap just above, and then we have premium levels further up where we also have another breaker block. Midterm, I remain bullish. I would like to see price continue higher, but wouldn't be surprised if we started to see a pullback before further continuation. From this point on, aside from that tiny fair value gap, there's very little in terms of PD raise until we start to get back into the premium areas where we have the breaker block and the sell side, the SPY side liquidity. So my guess is if we see continuation, it'll probably make it somewhere up here before we start to see a reversal and price continue to the downside. Okay, moving on to the daily time frame, you can see that we started the week bullish. We pushed up quite aggressively. We failed to break the previous high, and then we had a reaction and a massive push to the downside, likely in preparation for the manipulation before the big move. And you can see the next day we had further continuation to the downside, and then when the Fed announced the interest rates, that's when we had that massive manipulation, clearing everything in the range, coming deep into the order block before reversing and aggressively pushing to the upside. And then the next day we had further continuation, had somewhat of a pullback at the end of the day, but then on Friday we continued higher, and in the process breaking internal liquidity, creating a higher high, and even breaking structure that was created on the left. There was a fair value gap that was created on the way up before Friday, and then we'll likely have the creation of another daily fair value gap in this area unless we have a significant pullback. And for me, I would assume that we will see some sort of a pullback. I just hope we don't have another pullback like we've seen for the last month, like here, like here, like here, and like here. I'm hoping at this point that that's done and over with, and we don't get any more massive pullbacks. And we start to see EU pushing more and more aggressively to the upside. Okay, now finally, onto the hourly time frame. And this is where I'll do the review of the weekly price action. So prior to last week, you can see we started to shift bullish at the end of the week. And then at the end of last week, we started to have a pullback, and then when the market opened, we just did a lot of consolidation. Especially in Asia. If you look here, this is mostly Asia, and then London swept the highs, and then we manipulated the lows, came deep into this order block, thereafter aggressively pushing to the upside. We had continuation, breaking the previous high, breaking highs on the left as well, and then we came into the 4-hour fair value gap that was created on the way down of the previous push down, and then we had a reaction. So we had some initial reaction, then some consolidation, mitigation of the highs before pushing to the downside, created equal lows for some reason here. I'm not exactly sure why it would want to do that before reversing, breaking the highs and continuing further to the upside, failing to break the previous high. But what it did do is fill the 4-hour fair value gap, came into the daily order block, and thereafter you can see we had a reaction, pullback, and then continuation. I believe there was news. Apologize, I can't remember the news event at this time. But then we continued to aggressively push to the downside, sweeping these equal lows. And at this point, I was looking for reversals, but we didn't get it. We got continuation to the downside instead. We came into this hourly demand level. Thereafter, we reacted, created a 4-hour fair value gap with a push up, but did not mitigate it. Instead, we started to push down and continue to the downside. And this was Wednesday when we had all that crazy news. So started to have some news, and then aggressively coming right back down. And then we had the Fed announcing the interest rates, and that's when we had that manipulation to the downside, sweeping the previous low, as well as the equal lows that were created from 2 weeks ago. And then after that, reversing and aggressively pushing to the upside. And then we had further continuation, sweeping the range, and then continuation thereafter. The next day, we mostly saw consolidation, and then at the end of London session, we finally had an aggressive push to the upside. Again, at this point, we failed to break the previous high. We just mitigated the highs, came right back down. But this time into a fair value gap that was created on the way up, reacted off of it, then did a lot of consolidation before we had an initial push up, broke the highs, giving some confirmations of a shift, and then we had one last pullback, retesting the fair value gap, and thereafter a push to the upside. I was short from this area. I was long from this area on Thursday, and I was long from this area on Friday. But when we had the announcement of NFP where we aggressively shot to the upside, I actually closed the trade right when we came close to the highs, just a few minutes before the NFP announcement. I just closed it. What a big mistake that was, but to be honest, there was no way for me to know that it was just gonna shoot to the upside. The whole time I was thinking, yes, price is gonna go up, but I was expecting a manipulation before an aggressive push to the upside. And that's why I closed those trades, because I didn't want to be slipped and I didn't want to end up losing money when I was already in profit a decent amount, and just didn't want to lose that prior to news. But anyways, that's where we ended the week. We are consolidating in this area. If I think about what I want to look for next week, what you can see is we've already tested this fair value gap, and it kind of looks like a IOFED to me. So on Monday, if we have further consolidation in this area, if we get some sort of a manipulation to the downside, then I'll be looking for longs. And if I go to the 15-minute time frame, it'll be clear on what I'll be looking for. So my idea is this is the area that I'm thinking that will do consolidation, and the two areas I will be focusing on for that manipulation is this fair value gap here and the 15-minute demand that we have here. So let's say, for example, we're consolidating in this area and we continue to consolidate in this area, and then maybe we sweep the highs, and then we have the manipulation in these lows, hopefully have a shift, and I'll be looking for longs here. And the other scenario I would be considering is if the same thing happened here, that happened here instead. So these are the two scenarios that I'll be looking for on Monday. If this low over here goes, so if we break that low, then I'll consider that price is going to come down lower for a bigger pullback, and then I'll just wait until London or New York kill zone for a nice setup and take it whichever direction, whether it's short or long, and then come back to the charts on Tuesday, reevaluate, and hopefully we'll have some evidence to start to look for longs again. But anyways, just to sum up, it's been a wild month. If you look back and see all the major swings that we had while we're doing this higher time frame consolidation, but as I mentioned in the last video, it's quite typical to see this kind of consolidation in a massive range before we have a reversal. The market makers, they need to take profits from all the sell orders that were created on the way down before they reverse the price and start pushing it in the opposite direction. So hopefully all those crazy pullbacks are done now and price starts to push in one direction without all the crazy pullbacks. But for the short term and midterm, I will be looking for longs until there is a reason to change my bias based on new price action that's printed. Anyways, that's it for this weekend's update. Hopefully you guys found some value in today's video, and if you did, a like and a subscribe would be appreciated. Get some rest this weekend, and hopefully we start to see some cleaner price action from next week, and I'll see you for the next one. Peace.
Black Swan.